Okay. I'm ready. I think we're ready to roll. And stragglers can catch up. So tonight we have Kent Walliser. He's with Sagemoor. He's a wealth of knowledge. I would say especially on the viticultural side, and he's kind of gone into some really cool ways of having wine made from the vineyards he manages, and I'm really excited to have you guys listen to him. So with that, Kent, I'll let you go with an introduction, and we can go from there.
Well, thanks, James, and happy to be here. This is pretty exciting. I don't get to do this very often, and I like talking to people about wine and vineyards with Sagemoor. So a little background on me. My name is Kent Walliser. I direct the grape sales and wine sales for our project, Sagemoor Vineyards. And I hope some of you or most of you have heard of Sagemoor or our other vineyards that make up the group. So there's Bacchus, Dionysus, Weinbau, Gamache, and Sagemoor proper. So there's five vineyards. They were actually planted originally, Bacchus and Dionysus and Sagemoor, in 1972. And from the looks of the screen, most of you came along after 1972. So a few of us were around before 72. I was about 20 at the time. I wasn't part of the project then. It was actually led by several Seattle business people who were in their 40s and 50s at the time. There was no real grape industry in Eastern Washington. There were a couple wineries, namely like St. Michel was kind of getting started, and Columbia. But other than that, it wasn't like today where it's no big deal if somebody says, well, we're going to go plant a vineyard in Eastern Washington. It's like join the crowd, right? Same thing with wineries. So we planted, those guys planted about 450 acres into an industry that didn't really exist, and didn't really know where they were going to sell the grapes. But they were passionate about Eastern Washington and agriculture, and so they bought Sagemoor first in 1968, and there was tree fruit and no grapes. Between 68 and 72, they started talking to people in the industry about what to plant and where to plant, and one of their consultants on the whole thing was Walter Clore. Some of you may have heard of him, or you see the Clore Center in Prosser, which promotes Washington viticulture and winemaking, and there's a lot of history about him there. So he came on board and consulted with the partners and told them what to plant, and then he looked for more property. One place wasn't going to be enough, so they found some property which they started two partnerships on, but it's contiguous property or side by side, called Bacchus and Dionysus, and there were so many partners involved in those days that they had to come up with other names for the properties, because obviously one person wasn't going to get their name on the property. And so they called one Dionysus and one Bacchus. And if you've all had Roman and Greek mythology, you know who those guys are, those wine gods. And so then they, some years after that, they went into a partnership up in Mattawa on the Walloon Slope with a German guy named Longuth in 81, and they were going to plant, they were going to raise German style Riesling. And that venture was little known by anybody, but it went bankrupt about 1986. And our partners took over the vineyard, which at the time was about 240 acres, and contracted all the grapes eventually with Chateau St. Michel. So we've actually been a grower for Chateau St. Michel going all the way back to 1974, continuous since then. When I started with the company, I didn't start with the company until 2002. So by then, we had vines already 30 years old back then when I started. And the thing that brought me to it, I was in tree fruit all my life since I was a child. Grew up in a little town called Milton Freewater, Oregon, just south and across the border from Walla Walla, Washington, which became more famous with wine than just being called Walla Walla. Milton Freewater at one time when I was growing up was actually known as the pea capital of the world, if you can imagine such a moniker of notoriety. Grapes didn't appear in the Walla Walla Valley in the Milton Freewater side until the late 80s when Seven Hills planted some vineyard over there. So I grew up in that area. I raised apples and cherries, I knew what cold winters were like. I knew what raising tree fruit was like. I had very little interest or knowledge about wine grapes. And actually, when people started to plant wine grapes down there, I thought they were crazy because it was too cold. And I actually moved out of Wenatchee for a few years and worked for a Dole Fruit Company, and then came to Sagemoor in 2002, and fell in love with the wine industry. So started there then, and we continued to buy a little bit more property and plant different varieties of grapes along the way. When I started with Sagemoor, we had 15 winery customers. In 2002, if you guys were around and drinking wine, there were about 150 wineries in Washington. Now there were 1,000. So I kind of got in the industry at a good time, got to grow with a lot of wineries. We sold to about 15 wineries when I started, and now we sell to over 100 wineries in Washington. So we have about 1,100 acres under vine between Weinbau, Gamache, Sagemoor, Bacchus, and Dionysus. And so we sell to about 10% of the wineries in Washington and some wineries outside of Washington as well. We never had a winery in all those years. The original partners were adamant about not starting a winery, so we didn't. And along about 2012, the original partners were aging out. Nobody else wanted to take over the property, so we actually sold all the partnerships intact with all the employees, with all the names, with everything intact to a company in Natchez, Washington called Allen Brothers Fruit Company, who was more of a tree fruit company. And so they liked our business model and they liked what we were doing. And so we did that. All the same employees stayed on board. We kept the names, we kept the business plan, and we really specialized in selling to smaller wineries. And if you were to go to our website, sagemoorvineyards.com, you could see a lot of our winery customers, or you've seen our vineyard names on wineries in certain Seattle area. And so so it's like, okay, why if we have vineyards this old, aren't we making wine? Anybody would come up with that logical question, right? Well, the new owners were a little more amenable to doing that, and so we struck out to do that. We didn't still have a winery, but I knew a lot of winemakers, and so we entered into some custom crush agreements with about 3 different winemakers. So the first one was John Abbott, who had spent years at Abeja, and then he left Abeja and started another project called Devona. I've known John for many, many years. He worked with fruit in Bacchus since the late 90s when he was at Canoe Ridge, and we became friends over those years. He's very, very good in the vineyard, knows his fruit, and so for him it was we're going to make Cabernet. So we started in 14 making Cabernet, a wine we call Stars in a Row, and then in 2016, when we got a little more serious about making more wines, we added some wines to the portfolio. One which you're drinking tonight, called Miguel the Man, and some white wines. And the white wines were 2 Rieslings and a Sauvignon Blanc, a white Bordeaux blend called Without Rehearsal. So we've got some white wines, and those are made by a woman by the name of Allie Mayfield. She spent a few years at a winery in Walla Walla called The Walls, and that's where I worked with her. And so she's just got a great touch with white wines. If you are close to a PCC market somewhere in Seattle area, there's an estate white blend that they're selling at PCC, so you could get a little taste of that and see what that's all about. But I tell people I'm not a winemaker. I'm a winemaker maker, and so I had to go find winemakers that I like to work with and could bring the vineyard, speak the vineyard through the winemaker. Most wineries that you would go to, there's a winemaker that you kind of get latched onto, and they kind of speak about the vineyards through their wines. We're trying, because we're a vineyard, an estate vineyard, all of the wines that we make are from our own grapes that we raise, and we're trying to speak the vineyard and what the vineyards present in the bottle through an interpretation with a winemaker. And so the wine you're drinking tonight, Miguel the Man, the story behind that is pretty fun to tell because it's actually named after a real person that still exists, still works in a vineyard. I'll show you his picture here in a minute. So I've known Miguel Rodriguez since 2002 when I started with Sagemoor. He started as a young man, came from Mexico and worked at Sagemoor under his older brother Servando for a few years. And in 1986, the vineyard manager at Weinbau left and went to work for Chateau Saint Michel. And so Miguel and his wife moved to Mattawa. And in 1986, there was even less in Mattawa than there is now. It's kind of the middle of the state. There's a nice straight road that runs across the Walluk Slope. And the town of Mattawa is not very big, but it's pretty near and dear to us. So he went to Weinbau and he finished harvest in '86 and he stayed and he's been there ever since. So along in about 1996 or 97, Chateau Saint Michel came to us and wanted us to plant 50 acres of Cabernet Franc and 50 acres of Merlot. And those, if you look on the bottle you'll see Weinbau and you'll see Weinbau.12 and Weinbau.13 on the front of the label. Those are the two blocks that Miguel planted in 1997. They're side by side, and he has a lot of pride in that. And his favorite variety to raise, because it's difficult to raise, is Cabernet Franc. So I don't know how many of you just like pure Cabernet Franc, but I do. And I also like right bank blends. So that's kind of French, Saint-Emilion, usually mostly Merlot and Cab Franc. And so the wine you have is 70% Merlot and 30% Cab Franc. That's just from those two blocks at Weinbau blended together. And the winemaker that I work with there is Chris Peterson, who makes wine at Vineyard. He also makes wine for Passing Time, which is Dan Marino and Damon Heward. Those two guys joined up, and besides Vineyard, Chris makes that wine as well. And I met Chris in 2010. He buys grapes from us anyway, Cab Sauv and Cab Franc at Bacchus, and those grapes go into a wine he calls Sestina, which is a lovely wine, a Bordeaux blend. But making a right bank blend was the goal here, and putting these two blocks together and then naming it after Miguel. So I don't know if you can probably all see this. There's Miguel right there out in his vineyard. So that's about as close as I think I can get. Great guy. He's raised his family up there, and I wish he was here sometime. James and Pierce will have to do one of these and have Miguel sitting here, because I get excited about wine and what I'm doing with the vineyards. But Miguel, in his presence, you would buy cases of this wine. Me, you might buy some more. But with Miguel, so Miguel manages Weinbau now, and it's about 450 acres. He works with a lot of winemakers. If a winemaker goes out there, he's going to try to sell them something and go show them, and it's pretty powerful what he does. So I kind of hope you like the wine. I hope it blends well and hits your palate nicely. I think Chris has got a nice touch. We're looking for something that's got a nice soft mouthfeel and yet has enough structure with the Cab Franc that kind of comes through. The other kind of cool thing about this wine is just the fact that we put these two blocks together. I sell to a lot of winemakers that get fruit from Block 12 Merlot and Block 13 Cab Franc, but none of them ever made a blend out of those two varieties or those two blocks. Notable among those is Mike Janik, Gilles Nicot at Long Shadows, Marty Club at Lacole, Abeja. They all get that fruit and put it in something, but we wanted to blend it together and showcase what Miguel has done for the company, showcase what all his people do every day, all year. And just another picture at the end of harvest one year with the crew out there. Happy that harvest is over. But so that's kind of the story of the wine, and we've continued to make the same one, a 17 and an 18 I think the wines show really well. The other thing is when you compare vineyards and styles, it gets pretty warm on the Wallop Slope where we are. The soil structure lends itself to making big wines. Sometimes we've had winemakers over extract red wines up there, and they're too tannic, so you can very much take Weinbau and translate it into Red Mountain style wines. So coming up with something that's Merlot and Cab Franc and having a nice soft mouthfeel is a tribute to the winemaker and the grower. At Bacchus and Dionysus, the same varieties are just much more elegant and softer than what grows at Weinbau. So I've probably talked plenty at this point. And,
no, not at all. So with the 450 acres that are out there, is that, so Miguel obviously has a lot to do. Did you guys choose these grapes specifically? Because I think you said that he really liked the Cabernet Franc, but is this something that he wanted to make when you guys were deciding to make this wine, specifically because they're the blocks he really loves, or?
Well, he definitely loves Cab Franc, and I didn't want to make, it's probably my idea to make the right bank blend, but I went to him and I said, this is what I want to do, Miguel, and he's like, he's all over it. He loves the Merlot on that place too. I mean, we also have, at one time we had 100 acres of Riesling up there. We've got about 100 acres of Chardonnay that go to St. Michel. We raise a lot of Cabernet up there. Another variety that when we planted about 10 years ago, we added some acreage. We planted some Carmenere. I don't know how many of you drank any Carmenere out of Washington. It's kind of an interesting, if it's grown in a hot enough environment and gets ripe, it's pretty interesting. We have since planted Malbec, Mourvèdre, Grenache. We're going to plant more Grenache up there. We really like the way it performs in the vineyard and the wines that come out of it. What else have we got up there? Mourvèdre, Malbec, more Cab Franc. We're still planting more Cab Franc. We've also planted small pieces of two Italian varieties you may or may not have heard of. One called Sangrantino, another one Aglianico. They're really big tannic wines, but they get ripe up there, and so we're starting to play around with those. Some Petit Syrah, Petit Verdot. So it's kind of fun to do some experimental stuff, and we've got more coming. Trying to match the site with the wine variety is the tricky part.
It is. I mean, planting Sagrantino and Riesling in near proximity to each other is somewhat counterintuitive, but that should be really interesting.
We only have 2 acres of Riesling left up there, so that's
it's been all pulled out.
Yep.
Which vineyard? I don't remember. Pierce would tell me. Which vineyard was the Riesling, the dry Riesling that you had out the other day, Chris?
So that was the carving blocks. So that would have been the Bacchus and Weinbau, right?
Weinbau and Gamache.
Or is that
the dry Riesling?
Yeah. That's
Bacchus.
Yep.
So the fun thing for you guys, if you're drinking Riesling, I know Riesling has kind of fallen out of favor because everybody thinks it's too sweet or something, and
too delicious is more like it.
Shame on Washington for making a lot of uninteresting Rieslings, but that's starting to change with smaller producers. And the other thing that's happened with Riesling is we have some clones to work with. So the dry Riesling that we have that Pierce handles as well has 3 different clones in it that really kind of accentuate lots of different flavors. And Gamache provides some nice crisp acidity, and then Bacchus's 2 clones are real varietal, true, and it's a fun wine to drink. It's not just your sort of drier, flabby Riesling like you may have bought 3 years ago or something. It's pretty interesting and intense.
It's really sharp. It was the first Riesling I'd had in the state in a while that really caught my attention. That I felt like I was, much more of the German or Alsatian. It didn't have that flat, right? It had character. It was really neat to drink that. I think Gamache was actually one of our first fruit contracts.
Yeah,
right?
Gamache was one of the first ones we worked with.
We ended up not making the wine, but we made Chardonnay, had it picked really early and made it into sparkling, and I didn't think it was going to be very good, and it turns out I was wrong. So that's probably mostly your fault that it's actually pretty good. It wasn't us. So maybe could you talk a little bit about the changes you've seen over your 20 odd years in the viticultural, I guess technology and, maybe placement of vineyards, and how that's changed and where maybe you think that might go in the future?
So gosh, in almost 20 years I've been involved in this, so that was my cat jumping off the bookcase. Anyway, the evolution of varietal development has really been fun because we're slowly sorting out the properties that everybody is farming and getting more varietal correct for the property. For instance, at Dionysus, down here by the Tri-Cities, we had a hillside that faced towards Red Mountain and towards the west, and it had Cabernet and Chardonnay. And as I got to learn the wine industry, I realized that world-class Chardonnay does not grow next to world-class Cabernet pretty much anywhere in the world. So one of them had to go, and as it turned out, it was the Chardonnay. It's a warm site. The Chardonnay had to go, so we planted Petit Verdot. And we were all worried that it wouldn't get ripe, but it does get ripe. It gets lovely, actually. And we've got several wineries that now make single vineyard Dionysus, as well as, so now we've grown that to about 15 acres. So we've gradually pulled out Chardonnay on our warm sites, whereas Gamache, we bought that in 2016. We started to realize within a couple of years that site and white wines and acidity are just really explosive and wonderful. And so we've got Gamache, Sauvignon Blanc in our without rehearsal white Bordeaux blend. We've got Gamache Riesling in our Riesling, either sweet or dry, because it just brings a nice acidity to it, which is wonderful. So I think most growers have realized that they planted things. I mean, Sagemoor did this. They planted everything, kind of like a shotgun. And over 30 or 40 years, they realized what does really well on a site and what doesn't, and we're gradually changing varieties. The other thing is our original plantings at Bacchus and Dionysus were planted, the plants were planted 8 feet apart in the row, down the row, and the rows were 10 feet apart. And part of that was because they didn't know any better, and also because to get equipment through the rows at the time, they didn't have any real narrow equipment, so the rows were 10 feet apart. Now it's pretty common to plant plants 4 feet apart down the row, and the rows 8 feet apart. So what you do by doing that is you increase the plant density, but you do another thing. You get the balance in the plant between roots and the top in balance and mature at a younger age than when you plant 8 by 10. So if you plant 8 by 10, realize that the cordons have to go 4 feet in either direction to meet in the middle and to fill that space and to get the plants in balance between the root system and the roots. So by balance, I mean roughly the same size. So at 6 or 7 years old, you need enough root system to support the top. And sometimes the top will kind of outgrow the root system, and then the fruit isn't of good character. And so years ago when I started in the business, the typical planting was about 6 by 10. And that was all well and good, but we're crowding the rows closer and we're putting the plants closer. And what it does, it gets the vineyard into a mature state at a younger age. When I started, a lot of winemakers didn't want to buy grapes from me unless the vineyard was 10 years old, the planting. And now we hit a maturity at a much younger age. So that's pretty exciting. And then varietal development. And then the recent thing that's really coming along is mechanization. And you'd say, well, I only like my grapes if they're taken care of by hand and coddled along the way and all the little grapes and all that. Well, that's all well and good, but there aren't enough hands around to do all that work. And some of it is really difficult work to do. And so we developed machines that, the first one that made a big difference was just a pre-pruner that went and kind of shaved most of the canopy back down to a smaller size, which made it easier to prune. And then after that, and grapes are kind of like weeds. They just kind of grow from wherever. And so you're kind of trying to keep that a little bit under control. So we've got other machines that kind of can suck part of the leaves off to expose the fruit. We've got a machine that kind of takes off part of the suckers. And a lot of those things don't do a perfect job in the vineyard, but they take a lot of work out of it. And Sagemoor raises most of our grapes, we actually sell by the acre. So if you can kind of get your heads around that a little bit, we developed that over the years to where we're in a real partnership with the winemaker. So like one of our wineries we sell a lot of grapes to is Mike Janik in Woodinville, and we price a lot of those grapes so many dollars per acre, let's say maybe $9,000 per acre. And then Mike, he knows enough about viticulture. He gets kind of involved in some of the viticulture and the tonnage targets, and whether we do everything by hand or not, whether we pick by hand or with a machine. And so we're in a real partnership with most of our winemakers on how they want fruit raised, because they're trying to hit a wine style. So you could take what's in your glass, this Merlot and Cab Franc, and we could go to Weinbau, and we could get all the winemakers that get Cab Franc and Merlot, same blocks, and they could all make a wine, blending the two the way they want to, and you all could sit down and have 6 or 7 different wine styles out of those same 2 varieties from the same vineyard. And that's kind of the really fun part, I think, about our industry is you may run across Bacchus and Dionysus labeled wines from different wineries, and they all do taste different. And that's the fun part about exploring and growing with the industry. That's really changed. Sometimes in a block of, say, Cabernet, we might start picking on one day and finish the block 3 weeks later based on what the winemaker, when they want to pick. That's a big decision they make. And the other cool thing that's happening is we have I don't know if any of you have ever been to a winery where they're running hand-picked fruit through a crusher destemmer, and the clusters go through and out comes just berries, or you see them on a sorting table if you happen to go by during harvest. We've got machines in the vineyard now that can machine pick the fruit and sort all the rachises out and sort a lot of the bad berries out and deliver the berries in a fermenting tub directly to the winery, and it takes labor out on our end and takes labor out on their end. And there's a lot of reserve wines now being produced in Washington that are less and less touched by human hands, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. One of the wineries we work really close with, who's really led the charge, is Bookwalder in Tri-Cities. So it's really an evolution that its time has come. For a lot of reasons, but we're not hurting the wine by doing that, and understand the technology.
Yeah, especially as a winery or an industry grows with size, like you said, we kind of outpaced the labor available, and so you have to reconcile that somehow. And like you said, the wine quality seems to be maintained, which is pretty cool.
And when I say that, I mean we still on 1,100 acres. We still employ about 100 to 120 full-time people in the vineyard to take care of those 1,100 acres, and they're paid well. I mean, in my opinion, probably our average starting wage now is $15 or $16 an hour, and that's with 401k and health insurance and all the benefits. And so it's really important that we retain the people, because wine grapes, every operation you do from pruning and each operation after that has an impact on the next operation. So, and we really work with employees so they understand they're growing bottles of wine. They're not just, if they're out there taking leaves off, we teach them that by taking the leaves off and when we do it and with which variety, they're having an impact on the final product of the wine. So when they start pruning, or they do bud removal, or they do leafing or shoot thinning, eventually crop thinning, and then harvest, every one of those operations has an impact on the final product. And we spend a lot of time with our crew leaders. We go to wineries in the winter, 2 or 3 wineries. We take our crew leaders and they go taste wine out of barrels with the winemakers. we have winemakers come to the vineyard a lot and do the same thing and talk to the people about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to make. So there's an investment of at least some interest with the people in what we're trying to produce. And we do a lot of promotion within our crews. If there's positions that open up, we try to educate and train people up so they take an interest that there's a path towards promotion within the company. It's pretty fun, especially when the light goes on. Like Miguel Rodriguez. When I started with him, all the grapes at Weinbau went to St. Michel, 100%. And so I didn't really know what he knew about wine grapes. I didn't know if he liked wine. I certainly didn't know he was a salesman extraordinaire in stuck out in Mattawa, Washington. The guy could sell anything to anybody. But when we lost a contract to St. Michel in 2001 and we had to redo it, it opened up the possibility of selling grapes to a lot of wineries. And when the winemakers started showing up and they met Miguel, and then I watched it in action, this guy's a natural, and his passion for wine is unparalleled. So much so that in 2005, our industry rewarded him with a Grower of the Year award from the Washington Wine Growers Association. So he's even recognized amongst his peers as being extraordinary, and I think it shows in the glass.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It sounds like I got to go meet him. Sounds like a blast. I think like what you're talking about there is, I think we brought this up on other calls, but I think it's kind of lost on people how many really skilled laborers touch everything that goes into their bottle.
It's not typically what you read. I've been in ag all my life since I was a child, and typically what you read is we fall into the category of unskilled labor. And so over the years, whenever I can get somebody from anywhere out in a vineyard or in an orchard, and I can demonstrate that they have no skill whatsoever when it comes to raising grapes or apples or cherries, it's kind of a light goes on that some of these folks have been around a long time. Sadly, we recently lost a gentleman who was a crew leader at Bacchus and Dionysus. He started with the company in 1980. So he was a crew leader, so he taught people how to do pruning and thinning and crop load and then harvest. He recently passed away this spring after his 40th year in the vineyard. His name is Victor Perez. We're actually going to honor him this year, make a wine in his honor and his name with the people because of what he meant to us as a company. His neighbor, and we have another gentleman who's an irrigator in that same property. They started with the company a month apart. They've both been there for 40 years. And the other telling thing about Victor was he wasn't just a crew leader in the vineyard. We often refer to him as coach because he also played soccer and he coached soccer in like adult leagues in the Tri-Cities. He coached both of his sons. One of his sons got a scholarship at Walla Walla Community College to play soccer. Victor played soccer with his team until he got a little slow and couldn't keep up with the kids anymore. But his career in that is just as matched as what he did in the vineyards, and so that's kind of things we like to celebrate with people that work with us. So. Yeah,
it's I think it's a little bit undervalued in wine sometimes. The winemaker gets celebrated, and not necessarily wrongly so. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of other people that make a huge impact on what people drink, and sometimes that gets lost.
I mean, just as a side, and maybe winemakers personally, or people in the industry. As a grower that didn't have a winery until we started making our own wine, I kind of chuckled sometimes when winemakers, they have good intention and everything, but they would talk about our vineyards, and it didn't always come across like they knew what they were talking about. So, which was great. I mean, we loved the attention, but one of our goals when we brought our wines out was to kind of reverse that around and try to tell the story of the wine via the vineyard and have the winemaker interpret that, and so we can really bring the vineyards forward, estate vineyards. And Washington is unique in the entire world. I don't know any of you personally, and I don't know your wine knowledge, but Washington is an outlier in the world of wine. When you bring people from other parts of the world to Woodinville and they go to a winery, the typical response might be they look around and go, "Where's your vineyard?" And likewise, when they come to Eastern Washington and they come to our vineyards and they look around and go, "Well, where's the winery?" Because in most of the world, the vineyard and the winery are connected side by side, and that's mostly estate vineyards and estate wineries. And Washington has grown an entire industry with growers and winemakers, and it's a great partnership. We realize that we need each other tremendously. Neither one of us survives without the other, but we're not always doing estate wines, and that's kind of where we wanted to go, so that we could really showcase the vineyards. And
yeah, it is really, I mean, it is fairly unique in the world of wine. I think it's a question that Pierce and I have had a few times, and I mean, more and more the conclusion I've come to when they say, "Why don't you have your own vineyard?" is I just mess all of it up. I mean, I should leave it. I should leave it to pros who have been doing it a lot longer than I have. Who, maybe if I'm lucky, I learn a tenth of what they know by the time I'm done. But I think that's actually something that's sped the quality of the state's wine, is that you have winemakers who are focusing on making wine, and you have people who are focusing on growing grapes. I really
had a good time. Once I kind of understood the industry in the first couple of years, my background was always tree fruit. So when you're raising apples or cherries, your success is based on how many tons, if you will, that you grow per acre. And if it's red apples, it's like, how big are they and how red are they? And that all kind of gets graded because the consumer in the grocery store kind of sorts through stuff and leaves back stuff that doesn't look right or doesn't look good. So it really becomes kind of satisfying consumers. And as a grower of apples or cherries, once you put the bins of apples or bins of cherries on a truck and they go to a pack house, your job is kind of done. And the cherries and the apples lose their identity. Like, you go to the store this week and you buy cherries from Washington, you'll see a package and it'll have a brand on it, but you don't really know the orchard where they came from. And so getting in the wine business when I started was pretty exciting for me, because I could take this connection, and once I could get my vineyard name on a bottle and a consumer bought it, they just might start to connect that glass of wine with an actual place. And so in our branding and the labeling, which is something I really believed in, when you look at the bottle, you not only see our name, Sagemoor, and you see a name that kind of tells a story, but you see the actual blocks from whence the fruit came from. Those are the vineyards. The vineyard name is on there. The block that we identify with. I could even go down and identify the rows if I wanted to on the bottle. And I really felt like when we brought these wines forward, that more and more consumers are interested in where their food comes from and where the fruit is grown. And so that was the idea behind the branding on the bottle, was to get that connection so that when consumers could start to build a relationship with the vineyard. And that's why we put a picture or a caricature of Bacchus and Dionysus on the label, because we don't have a chateau. If you don't have a chateau, then you have to go to the vineyard. We had vineyards, so that's why we put the vineyard on the label, was to present that sense of place to where the fruit came from. And ultimately that's the story. So you kind of have an idea why you're looking at that label and going, why did they do this and why is that on there? And it's all about that story and making a personal connection with you folks sitting at home, and you don't get a chance to come to the vineyard, maybe the vineyard can come to you.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, and even more than that, I think on your website, a lot of those vineyards have cameras that are live feeds. You can go and look at the vineyards too. I know on a handful of them. So I think that's a really neat way of looking at it. You pick some really great winemakers to help you kind of interpret the vineyards back too, right? I mean, like you said, right. In this one, Peterson doesn't have a real heavy hand. in this wine, and it does let the Merlot and Cab Franc do their job instead of the winemaker. It's and really all the wines I've tasted from Pierce are that way. So it's pretty cool. I think I'll kind of open it up to any questions people might have. Feel free to either unmute yourself and ask or type them in. And otherwise, Pierce can ask a million questions too. I'd
love to hear what you all think.
While they answer, I guess I do have one question. You kind of gave your age away. Your job's not that easy. How many years you plan to do this?
I got one project I'm working on that I want to see to fruition. I want to get an actual physical winery going and get a team built around that, and then I don't know. It's just as long as I have fun doing what I'm doing, it's pretty nice to be connected to an industry that's this much fun.
Yeah,
but who knows?
That's a great answer.
It's the best, and I'm having a blast working with the Sagemoor wines in the market. So
yeah, they're really good. I've been really happy tasting them.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, what do you guys think? You guys like Right Bank blends? This is like intel I got to have now.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, looks like we're good.
Cool.
Yeah,
I like you guys all. I like that group all dressed in purple there. You guys aren't Huskies, or is it just a color correct on?
Yeah, you guys talked about that before, color coordination.
Yeah, well, and I especially like person just out of frame is wearing blue. Do you guys make him sit over there?
Didn't want to wreck it for everybody. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whoa. Okay. Well, I guess we can go with that. It was really a pleasure to talk with you, and hopefully we'll get to work a lot more together. Pearson, you get to work together, but sometimes I don't get to do all these cool relationships here, and definitely would look forward to working with Sagemoor Fruit again, since we kind of started with it and kind of want to work our way back into some of this stuff. But it's a pleasure to have you, and thanks for joining us. And I love listening to it. I could listen to it forever. So
yeah, Kent, like you said, I'd love to put something together if we can, get something together at some point with Miguel, and maybe grab Lacey, and
sure.
Yeah, we can really blow this up and do it as many times as we want. So
that would be a blast. Cool. I would really love that myself.
We've got Allie Mayfield, we've got John Abbott, we got more characters here.
Yeah.
Who listen to me all the time, and we showcase another wine, the white wines or the cab sometime with your folks. And,
I'd really like to get Riesling into people's hands, because it's one of my favorite grapes that no one wants to drink. So,
so they try it.
We'll force feed it to them. We'll dry Riesling.
So I've done I've done quite a few tastings. Well, we got one question here from Helene, asking about changing out varieties. It's kind of an interesting thing, changing out varieties. We've got a block of Riesling at Dionysus that was planted in '73. That because it's that old, I hate taking it out because it's that old. But I've had to finally swallow hard and realize that we've got to focus our Riesling on some blocks that do really well. And this one, we do so well at Dionysus raising Cab and Merlot that we're going to turn into Cab and Merlot. And because it's just a site that does really well there, and probably we've got other sites that we should be doing Riesling on, but that's just the way it goes. And so sometimes, I think with 1,000 acres, you got a lot more latitude to try things. Like you can have 21-acre trial sites, so you can find varieties that might grow, and somebody takes a hold of them and then they go somewhere. That's how a lot of varieties in Washington started, with just a few acres. The first Syrah was planted, I think, in 1986 by Mike Sauer. So, it's just kind of trial and error. And if you're making money on a block, you kind of hesitate to take it out. But eventually, sometimes you hit a spot either with disease or with something else, and then you start looking around. And you'd like to have a nice contract with a winery so that take the risk out of it, but by and large, the grower really has to just buck up and do a certain amount of planting all the time. If you don't replant something, sooner or later you've got nothing but old vineyard. And I'm a real proponent of about a 3% replant rate. If you're think about it, if you're at 2%, pretty soon you're going to have a lot of, that's a 50-year rotation. That's a long time. 3%, it cuts it down to about 30 years, which isn't too bad. So you've got to rejuvenate and replant, keep up with technology.
I actually really liked what you said about understanding how, as you plant closer, it diminishes the time to maturity. Our last call, he is a fervent proponent of really old vineyards because he thinks they produce better wine, but my experience hasn't necessarily been that. So you giving that explanation, that I hadn't connected that with the top and then the root structure below. So that was also great. And so, being able to plant, 3% a year, you're not waiting 10 years, turnover wise.
I mean, if you've only got a 20 or 30 acre vineyard, it's harder to replant 3% a year because that's only, an acre or two. But it's hard to make a good living on 20 acres of grapes unless you're making wine out of all those acres. So it's different sizes fit for everybody. But for our size, we need to keep planting something and experimenting and working with wineries that want to try things. So we keep evolving. Yeah.
Another question that I forgot to ask, do you feel like, since you're selling mostly by acre, do you feel like you've had winemakers kind of start to agree on tonnage? That may vary by varietal, but do you think that there's kind of a commonality in what they think for what a quality grape looks like?
Back in the 2000s, there was this sort of fad that was going around about winemakers who really weren't growers and hadn't been making wine that long, but sort of had this idea that, okay, I want my Cabernet at 2.5 tons to the acre. And you go, oh, okay. Why? Well, that's just what it's supposed to be. And so we would kind of accommodate folks and we would do that. And then the other fad that went around for a while is, when there's a time in the season that's called veraison, which is the change when grapes start to swell up and they start to change color. And so some of these same winemakers would say, and we don't want any water put on our grapes after veraison, which is after veraison is completed, which all it does is just dry out the plants and dry out the grapes and basically turn them into prunes. And so it took a while to kind of get some research behind some of these things and convince winemakers that, no, we can irrigate all the way through harvest and it won't ruin your grapes. And we can raise a balanced crop. We just call it a balanced crop. Like, depends on the site. Maybe at Gamache, Cabernet, we could only mature properly like 3 tons the acre, but at Weinbau, we could maybe mature 5 tons. And so we've kind of learned that every variety has a sweet spot, and then you kind of fudge that up or down depending upon winemaker style. But fortunately, people are kind of backed off. And most of that prescription stuff came from winemakers and growers just trying to make winemakers happy so they could sell grapes. But in the end, we're learning that every site has its day and its demands on what it can do and what it can produce. And so we're being smarter about all that. And winemakers are kind of starting to come around and go along with it. So it's a good deal.
That's good. I'll make sure to beat that into our winemaker.
It's always healthy.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I think we can probably leave it at that, but I'd love to have you on again or Miguel or any of those guys. That would be a blast, and get some more Sagemoor wine in front of people. I think you guys are doing an awesome job, and really look forward to, like I said, working with you, whether that's drinking wine in a live stream or getting grapes from you. So thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Kent. I'll be in touch soon.
All right. Cheers, folks.